This happened to me and my nephew Jeff about 8 years ago. Each summer since around when he started high school, I would take him somewhere for a week when he was off for summer vacation. My sister and her husband were always happy to have a break, and they liked that he would be away from the screen for a while. One year, we did a road trip through the mountains and stopped at some motels along the way. The summer before this happened, we went camping at a state park. This summer, however, I rented a place in the woods. Judging by the pictures and the description online, it looked like a pretty rustic cabin. It didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing. For any more than a week, it might get kinda tough, but Jeff said he was fine with it, so I was too. By the way, I was 42 and he was 18. I packed up my car before picking up Jeff. We had to bring enough food for the whole time, so I loaded it all into my car. There were no stores close by, and I couldn't count on catching anything wild, even though there was a good fishing spot on the property. I was also sure to bring my firearm just in case, something I always did when going out into the wilderness. I picked up my nephew at his house, and he got into my car. For the first hour or so, he couldn't put his phone away. He was super busy on that thing, checking for likes on his selfies, and probably catching Pokemon, whatever kids do on their phones these days. That didn't bother me too much, because cell service would be gone soon. It was just a matter of time before he would have nothing better to do than spend time with his favorite uncle. As we pulled up to the cabin, I noticed an old beat-up truck parked outside. It seemed out of place, given that we were supposed to have the place to ourselves. I pulled up next to it, leaving a few car widths between us. The door was slightly open, and I could see a rough stack of papers on the dashboard. While we were still sitting in my car, a man came out of the cabin. He was middle-aged, wearing worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt. I told Jeff to stay in the car, and then I got out and approached the man. He quickly explained that he worked for the cabin's owner. According to him, he was just finishing up some last-minute cleaning and maintenance. I thanked him, and after a brief chat, he climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. Jeff and I then headed inside to check the place out. The cabin was more spacious than I expected, with a nice living area complete with a stone fireplace and 2 small bedrooms. Not exactly a palace, but it did seem larger than in the pictures. Jeff claimed the room with the better view, and I took the other one, which had a smaller window overlooking the woods. I could have overruled him, but he called it, and playground rules were in effect. We went for a short walk around the immediate property, but didn't get far before it began to get dark. Not much happened that night or the next day, but the following evening after dinner, Jeff and I were sitting in the living room talking. Every once in a while, he would pull out his phone and check for service. To my surprise, occasionally he would actually get online for a few minutes at a time. That kid was like an addict with his phone. It was like a drug for him. Once he got cut off, he put the phone down, and again, we kept talking. Just then, a knock on the door startled us. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was far away. I cautiously got up and went to answer the door. It was too dark to see much outside, because there were no lights, and we only had oil lamps on the inside. When I opened the door, I found the man from the truck standing there, the same one that we saw on the first day. He looked a bit uneasy, shifting from one foot to the other as I opened the door. "Sorry to bother you this late," he started, his voice sounding a bit nervous. "I just need to check on the gas line inside." I wasn't sure, but eventually stepped aside to let him in. As he walked past me, I began to regret my decision, call it a hunch. Jeff, who had been quiet so far, pulled out his phone, as he was known to do. Then the man headed towards the kitchen. He seemed to be fiddling with something under the sink. I went and sat down next to my nephew. A moment later, he leaned over to me and whispered, "I just messaged the owner. There's no maintenance guy. He just told me." I glanced at the man, who seemed to be going through the cabinets in the kitchen. I got up quietly and went to my room to get my gun. I slipped it into my belt under my shirt and walked back into the living room, trying to act casual. I was hoping that he would just leave and nothing would happen. Jeff watched me, his phone still in hand. We waited there for another 5 or 10 minutes before I decided to make a move. I went into the kitchen and found the man still fiddling around. "Is everything okay in here?" I asked. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants, then he turned to face me. There was a brief moment where his eyes darted to the outline of my gun under my shirt. I just barely noticed it. The look on his face was a split second, but it was clear as day. "Yeah, all good. Just finishing up," he said. I could tell he was eager to leave. "I think it's best for you to go now," I told him directly, my hands resting subtly on my belt. We weren't told of any maintenance tonight, and the owner confirmed that no one was supposed to come by, so it's probably best that you go and don't come back." The man didn't argue. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and then headed for the door. I watched him go, making sure he left the property before I locked the door behind him. We don't know if he was going to rob the place in some way, or if he had some more dangerous intentions. The one thing that I find most troubling, though, is how different the whole thing might have turned out if I hadn't brought my firearm. I have two good friends from when I was growing up, Sean and Patrick. We were close all the way through college, and then I moved to a town about 2 hours away. We would still see each other at least once per month, but it was a far cry from before. I had got married the year before this happened, so that year I didn't get together with the guys very many times. We had planned a camping trip in the summer at Patrick's suggestion. Dennis and I had little experience with the outdoors, but Patrick would go with his dad a few times every year, so he was like our guide. Patrick planned the whole thing, and he told me that we were going to a spot close to where he had gone with his dad before. As he told me, this particular spot had only been open for a few years, so it was not that well established yet. Patrick's idea was that it would be less busy because of that. He got all the gear we needed, except for personal stuff. I got my own tent because I like my own space, but Sean and Patrick were going to share one since he had a giant tent. It was an old military-style canvas tent that Patrick used for winter trips. Since our spot was going to be car access, the extra weight was fine. We packed everything into Patrick's truck and then set off together. I left my car at his house because I was planning to get it on the way back. It was about a 5-hour drive for us, and I hadn't seen that kind of scenery in years. There's something about getting out of the city now and then that is so refreshing. We arrived late in the afternoon, all of us feeling excited. We unloaded the car quickly and set up the big tent first. It was a 2-man job, but I stood on the side and supervised. Once it was up, we tossed everything in and walked around a bit. My tent was easy to set up, so there was no rush. There were no designated spots at that place, but there was one large clearing that seemed like the only logical place to set up. There were 3 or 4 fire pits there already, so that kind of marked the different sites. I don't think it was official, though. After walking around the area for a while, we spotted a stream, which was on the map. It was about 5 feet wide, with a strong current. It looked like it could drag you away pretty easily, so I knew that we would have to be careful filling up our bottles. Patrick said it was safe to drink from, so I made a mental note that it was there. Then the 3 of us headed back to camp. Sean and Patrick decided to stay and finish setting up, while I went and gathered firewood. As I got away from the site, it wasn't that hard to find some good pieces, so before long, I had all I could carry. I headed back to unload, and then I was planning to head out for more. But as I made my way back to the camp, arms laden with sticks and logs, I noticed a man setting up an old tattered tent near our site. The tent was in a sorry state, riddled with holes and gashes, and it looked like it could barely keep out the wind, let alone any rain. I was slightly annoyed at having to share the spot, but I simply nodded to him in passing and kept walking. It was a public site after all, and he had as much right to be there as we did. I didn't feel like striking up a conversation, though. I just wanted to get back to my friends and start a fire before it got too cold. When I got back to my friends, I whispered to Patrick, "Looks like we're not alone." "Yeah, I was hoping we would have the place to ourselves," he said. We saw the guy setting up his site about 100 feet away from us. He hung a tarp over his tent, which seemed like a good idea, and I saw him disappear into the woods, probably to gather firewood as I had. After that, I didn't pay any attention to him for a while. As it got dark and the stars came out, we had our campfire going. We all sat down around the fire. All of us had one of those fabric chairs with the cup holder on the sides, and we all had a beer in ours. As the hours slipped by, I noticed that the man who had set up his tent near ours hadn't returned. His tent sat quietly alone in that spot, but the man was not there. Sean thought he might be sleeping, but Patrick was sure that he never came back. His seat was facing that direction, and he was sure that he didn't. It was unusual for somebody to set up camp and then just disappear without any sign, so we were all a little spooked. "Weird that he hasn't come back yet," I commented to my friends, nodding towards the lonely tent. We continued to chat and joke, but part of my attention remained fixed on that battered tent. I was expecting, or at least hoping, that at any moment its owner would return. It had been hours, though, and I couldn't imagine what he was doing in the woods all by himself. The fire eventually burned down to embers, and we decided to turn in for the night. It was well past midnight by then, so I was getting tired. When morning came, I woke up at around 7 a.m. As I emerged from my tent, the chill in the air made me pull my jacket tighter around me. The first thing I noticed was that the man's tent was still untouched. His flap was closed just as it was the night before. Still no sign of him, I said aloud, more to myself than to my friends who weren't up yet. I waited alone for about half an hour, and then I woke up the guys. We gathered for a quick breakfast around the fire pit, and then I said, "You think he's in there?" Then I pointed to the tent. "I don't think so," Patrick said. "We would have heard him come in," he added. After we ate, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look at his campsite. Approaching cautiously, we called out, "Hello, anyone there?" but no response came. His tent was as shabby up close as it had looked from a distance, and a peek inside one of the large holes revealed nothing but a few scattered belongings: a backpack, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and an old pair of boots. It looked as though he had planned to return. Outside the tent, we noticed several cigarette butts scattered around, but we didn't know if they were recent or not. We spent the next few hours combing the nearby area, calling out and looking for any sign of the man, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. By midday, after hours of fruitless searching, we were growing concerned. We gathered back at our campsite, weary and unsettled. "We should call for help," Patrick finally suggested. We all agreed without hesitation. We tore everything down and tossed it into the truck, not bothering to pack it up nicely. As soon as the decision was made, it felt like an emergency, and it really was. The drive to the nearest ranger station felt longer than it had just a day before. Patrick was speeding, but it still felt too slow. Upon arriving, we reported what we had found: the abandoned tent, the cigarette butts, and the man who had disappeared. The Rangers promised to send a search team to the area. They asked us to stay available for any follow-up questions, but allowed us to head home. Weeks passed, and the mystery never resolved. The man was never found, and no further clues emerged from the searches. The sad reality of the outdoors is that accidents can happen, and scavengers are all over the place, especially at night. Patrick sometimes sets up trail cameras on his trips, and the animals that come out will shock you. Wolves, coyotes, and bears are all common. If you want my opinion, I think the man was filling up his water in that stream. He probably fell in and drowned in the fierce current, and then water washed him away, and scavengers got him, never to be seen again. It's a grim idea, but I think that's what happened to him. Rest in peace. I went out on a solo camping trip a few years ago. It was my first year of work after college, so things were tough back then. I wasn't making much, and my apartment was expensive. Needless to say, I was stressed out most of the time, so I was hoping to forget about most of that stuff for the weekend. The trail I chose was one of the more remote in my state. I had done most of the easy ones around there with my friends already. Some of them were just day trips, but this time I was going for 2 whole nights. It wasn't my first time going out by myself, but it would be the longest solo trip I had ever done. I had everything ready in my car when I went to work on Friday. My plan was to head out right after work, so when I was done at the office, I hit the highway heading out of the city. The other side was clogged with commuters, but I had nothing but a clear road ahead of me. I stopped at a fast food place on the way, then made it to the trailhead just as it was getting dark. There wasn't anywhere to set up my tent for the night, so unfortunately I had to sleep in my car. I stretched out in the back seat, but it was still cramped. I'm 6'4", by the way. I didn't sleep particularly well, but I woke up early and then dipped into my packed food for breakfast. By 7:30, I locked my car and started walking to the trail. There were about 5 other cars stopped there, which was about what I was expecting. I hadn't seen another person though, so I assumed everyone was already in there. About halfway through the first day, the trail dipped into a secluded valley. Nobody else was out there that I had seen so far, till I noticed 2 men approaching me in the opposite direction. We met on a narrow part of the path. There were trees on both sides. I stopped and moved aside to let them pass, and as they did, they stopped to talk to me. They asked where I was headed and how long I'd been on the trail. All just normal pleasantries that you'd expect. One of them looked like a big trucker guy, with a long beard and a baseball hat. The other was younger, probably no older than me, and I was 24. They were both wearing blue jeans and t-shirts. Not exactly hiking clothes, but they did have large backpacks, so that was fairly normal. We talked for a few minutes, and I told them that I should be on my way, but a chill ran through me as I moved on. At the time, I thought I was being too paranoid, but it can be really quite creepy to run into strangers in the middle of nowhere. There was an unspoken tension because I knew they could do anything to me. It was really up to them. A lot of you are probably going to get on me for not having a gun, and maybe I deserve it, but I never learned to use one, so I thought it was better to leave them alone. I continued my hike, and I was happy to be on my own again. I looked over my shoulder several times to make sure I wasn't being followed. The trail was winding though, so I wasn't that reassured when I didn't see anyone behind me. When it was getting dark, I found a spot to set up my camp for the night. The trail had established spots where you were supposed to set up. You were not allowed to just set up anywhere, because they wanted us to use the outhouses and keep the place clean. The point is that my spot was the only one for a mile in either direction, so there shouldn't have been any reason for anybody to be close by at night. By the time I pitched my tent, the sun was almost completely down. Once I sat down to relax, I noticed how quiet it was. The glow from my headlamp pointed at the ground next to the steel fire pit, which had a half-burned log and some scraps of paper that must have been left by the last people. It was cold, so I decided to make a small fire and have something to eat. I had brought some of those just-add-water type of backpacking meals, but didn't bother to make one. I just had an energy bar and some chocolate instead. After about an hour, I put the fire out and went into my tent. As it got later, the forest sounds seemed to get louder. I turned over in my tent, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and tried to get to sleep. An hour or two must have passed, and just as I was finally beginning to relax, a faint sound hit my ears. It was a soft whispering, barely audible over the wind rustling through the trees. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. There was definitely more than one voice. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to make out what was being said. Peeking out one of the mesh windows in my tent, I could see the faint glow of a cigarette about 30 feet away. It was too dark to see very many details, but there was definitely somebody there. I looked at my phone for the time, and it was past 1 in the morning, way too late for anybody to be hiking by. And like I said before, there were no other campsites nearby. For whatever reason, I knew something was off, so I decided that I had to hide somewhere. My tent had doors on both sides, so I quietly unzipped the one on the far side and slipped out. I was wearing clothes because it was kind of cold, but I didn't have any shoes. As quietly as I could, I made my way to the tree line. There was just enough moonlight to get there without tripping over something. I had my phone with me, but of course, there was no service. I lay down among the brush and watched the small ember of that cigarette from a distance. They stayed put for another 10 minutes or so, and I started to think that I had overreacted, but then I watched as the two figures approached my campsite. They were still whispering to each other, but it was impossible to tell what they were saying. The glow of the cigarette bobbed closer as they neared my tent. One of them called out softly, "Hey, anyone there?" But I didn't answer. They waited a few seconds, and then one of them said a little louder, "He must be asleep." I almost flipped out when I saw them start to unzip the other side of my tent. One of them leaned over and peered inside. One of them had a light out at this point. After a moment, they stepped back, looking around and talking quietly. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but one of them definitely said, "Where is he?" The other answered, "I don't know." Eventually, they moved away from my tent, still occasionally looking back, as though puzzled by my disappearance. After what felt like forever, one of them stamped out his cigarette and disappeared back into the darkness of the forest. I remained hidden, not daring to move. I was cold, but not close to freezing. It was late in the summer, so it was probably around 50 degrees. As it began to get light, I felt a cautious relief. The sun was bright in no time, and I finally came out from the tree line. When I walked over to my tent, both doors were wide open, one from my escape and the other from the two men who came for me. Other than that, my campsite was relatively undisturbed. As far as I could tell, nothing was stolen, and there was no damage to my tent either. The fire was long out, but I lit it up again to have a hot breakfast. I was pretty cold. After that, I quickly gathered my belongings and threw them into my backpack. I took my tent down quickly, threw it in too. I was expecting to see those two men waiting for me somewhere, but luckily they didn't show. With my backpack ready and no sign of the strangers, I set out on the trail quickly. I thought my visitors were those two men who I ran into on the way in, but I didn't see them closely enough to be sure. It was just their stature against the moonlight that seemed familiar, but I can't be that certain. I passed several other hikers on my way, and whenever I saw someone else, I was worried it would be the guys who visited me. Just my luck when I was about an hour away from my site, I saw the two men from the day before. They were at another site just off the trail. They had a fire going, and one of them was smoking a cigarette. As I passed, the older one looked over to me on the trail and shouted out, "There he is." That instantly sent a chill down my spine. It was like he was taunting me. I turned my head back to the trail in front of me and kept walking, not wanting to give any reaction. Soon enough, I was back in my car. Once inside, I locked the doors, finally allowed myself to fully exhale. I started the engine and drove away. I knew I'd be hesitant to camp alone again after this. The experience really rattled me. It's anybody's guess what they were going to do to me, but it couldn't have been good.